Hi, I'm Bernadette Toohey from the Missionaries of God's Love Sisters, and I'm really excited today to be speaking with you about the new evangelisation. So before I get into our topic for today, I want to introduce myself because it will give the basis of why I'm so passionate about teaching you about evangelisation. So I was born into a Catholic family and went to Mass always growing up as a family. As a young girl, went to Catholic schools. I was part of an Antioch group when I was 16, which was our local parish youth group. And I also went to a World Youth Day when I was 21. So that was a big turning point for me when I went to World Youth Day, because up until that point, my life just looked pretty similar to all of the other young people around me. But I had a really big transformation at that World Youth Day. And after that, it was the first time that I'd ever thought about consecrated life. It was the first time that I really wanted to share my faith with other young people. And I really wanted to live for the Lord alone. So it was a really exciting time, and it propelled me into youth ministry as well. So I was a volunteer for the World Youth Day that was held in Sydney in 2008. And I travelled all around Australia telling young people that they had to be there in Sydney to experience this amazing event. So that was my first real experience as an evangelist. And I went on then to spend 4 years in youth ministry in a Catholic school. And then I joined the Sisters in 2012, and I've done a lot more youth ministry in my time with the Sisters, in prisons, in schools, in parishes, at big events like World Youth Day and the Australian Catholic Youth Festival. And I'm really excited to teach on these topics and to equip more youth ministers to go out and to tell people about the love of God, because it's impacted my life so personally and really transformed me in a way that I could have never imagined. So it's really exciting for me to be part of the new evangelisation and to be a youth minister and someone that's working with people in this way. And I hope that that's what is inspiring you as well. So what is the new evangelisation? I'm going to get into some basics first of all, because it's important that we understand what evangelisation is to start with. So as we begin, you might like to ask yourself the question, well, what is evangelisation? You might already know the answer to that, but if you don't, evangelisation, the word evangelisation, comes from the Greek word evangelion, which means good news. And you might notice if you see that word written down, it's actually got the word angel within it. And we know from the Gospels that it was always that the angels were the bearers of good news. So evangelisation just means sharing the good news. You might also like to ask yourself at this point too, well, what is the good news? Do you have a grasp upon what is this good news that we're supposed to be sharing? So the way that I like to remember it is actually through a quote from Pope Francis. So he quoted this in Evangelii Gaudium, and he says that the good news, the kernel of our faith, or what we call the Kerygma, is this: that Jesus Christ loves you, that he gave his life to save you, and now he's living every day at your side to enlighten, strengthen, and free you. Okay, so that's something that would be great to memorize or just to know and to have at hand, that that is the kernel of our faith. Okay, that is the good news. Some of this might be reminding you of our gospel stories, and you might be thinking to yourself, well, when was the good news first proclaimed? Okay, there's lots of different gospel stories where we see the good news proclaimed, but some of the ones that come to my mind is when the women are at the tomb on Easter morning, and the angels are outside the tomb saying to them, he is risen. Okay, and it was those women that ran to tell the other apostles, to tell the disciples of Jesus, that he'd conquered death, that he'd risen, that he was alive. This is the first proclamation of the good news. You might also remember too that it was from those same people, just a few women, that first saw Jesus, that first proclaimed the good news. They told the apostles, and then, as you know, at Pentecost, the Holy Spirit came, and those people that had gathered in the upper room that were so fearful, that were locked away in that room, were filled with the Holy Spirit and given the ability to go and to share that same good news with so many other people. Okay, it was just a small gathering that day at Pentecost of people, but it's incredible to think that those people in the early church were the first evangelists that took the good news to all different countries, to all different places. You might even like to think about, well, how did the good news get to different places? How did it get to Australia? How did it get to places like India? it's pretty incredible to think that just from that first evangelization, those first witnesses, over time, Christianity has spread across the world so that now, in our current time, there's around 2.3 billion people that call themselves Christians. That's a pretty powerful proclamation of the gospel from people like St. Paul, from people like Mary Magdalene, from missionaries that went to different countries and took the gospel there. And that's the legacy, that's the shoulders that we're standing on when we call ourselves evangelists in this era as well. So that's a little bit about what evangelization is. There's been this incredible spreading of the good news across many countries, across our whole world. In our own context here in Australia, though, it's kind of like the opposite is sort of happening when you look at our statistics. So we know that there's statistically a decline in belief in God, and statistically there's a decline in practice of people going to church, of people attending church weekly or even monthly. So from the 2016 census, just over 50% of Australians called themselves Christians. And so in my understanding, there's about 50% of people here in Australia that believe in God and that attribute that name Christian to their lives. So the other statistic is how are people practicing their faith. So that's been declining as well. So in the 1950s, there was about 64% of people were attending church in Australia. The latest statistics we have say that that's down to about 16% here in Australia, and that weekly, around about 10% of people here in Australia are coming to church. Okay, so that's what people are saying statistically. So I don't know if you think that that's a lot of people, but the way that I would kind of describe it is it means that if you're in a normal kind of social setting, maybe you're on the bus, for example, it means that if you split that bus in half, there's around about half the bus believe in Jesus, okay, call themselves Christian, believe in God, have a faith in Christianity of some description, and the other half don't. So I don't know whether you think that that's more than you would expect or less than you would expect. Then say if you take around about a quarter of the bus, they're your people that are attending church every now and then, and that first 10% of the bus is the people who are going to church every week across all of the different churches. So there's still some hope that we can be those evangelists that take the good news out into our country as well in our own times. But it's interesting to know that over time there has been this decline, and that's the context that we're evangelizing into here in Australia. Okay, so in summary, we've seen this incredible decline here in Australia. So my parents, they were around in the 1950s and 1960s. The Church of Australia in that era looked very different to the church of today. In my parents' era, going to church was a really normal thing to do, and a lot of people did it. It was the fabric that held a lot of society together. The sporting clubs, youth clubs, it all kind of revolved around the church. And just a couple of generations later, just around 60, 70 years later, we're here at this point where we essentially live in a secular society here in Australia. So that's the context that we're ministering into when we evangelize in this day and age. So now we're going to talk a little bit about, well, given that context, what then is the new evangelization? If we know what evangelization is, what do we mean when we say the new evangelization? Basically, it comes from Pope John Paul II in 1991, and he said this. He said, "I sense the moment has come to commit all of the church's energies to a new evangelization. No believer in Christ, no institution of the church can avoid this supreme duty to proclaim Christ to all peoples." So he said that in a document called Redemptoris Missio, and again in 1991. So around about 30 years ago, he proclaimed what we call the new evangelization. So why did he do this, and why at that particular time? So what Pope John Paul II was speaking into was he was speaking into countries like ours, which we would call de-Christianized Western nations. So countries where Christianity used to be the fabric of society, used to be the bedrock of society, were becoming less and less Christian. That was one of the reasons why he sensed that the time had come for a new evangelization. The second reason is that he could see that the forces of secularism, relativism, and scientism had meant that across society we'd lost the sense of God in a large way, that all of those things had led people to really question their belief and had ultimately had a part in leading to this decline in belief and practice that we can see in our statistics. The third reason is that the church had relied too much on the cultural transmission of faith. So like I said before, my parents went to church because their parents went to church and so forth all the way back. But that doesn't necessarily happen now. In our era now that you'll find out more about through this course, I'm sure, we're living in the age of authenticity, and people only really practice a religion if it makes sense to them individually, not just because their family or their culture practices it, but it needs to make sense to them on an individual level. And this was very new, and it's very different to the eras that have gone before. A fourth reason is that missionaries in new countries brought the teaching, the sacraments, the structures of the church, but they needed to evangelize on a deeper level. That the people that they'd evangelize needed to know Christ personally, not just all the extra things like doctrine and the structures of the church and the sacraments, but they didn't really have a personal belief in Jesus. So these are some of the reasons why Pope John Paul declared this need for a new evangelization. And what was he hoping would come through the new evangelization? So number one would be that people would have an encounter with Jesus, that they would come to really know Jesus in a personal way. That for a lot of people in the past, the emphasis had been on teaching doctrine and morals, but they'd never had a personal relationship with Jesus. It's almost like when we teach our young people about the sacraments, and unfortunately in some corners people would say, well, do you know what? Here in Australia, confirmation day is almost like graduation day from the church, because that's the last sacrament often where we'll see young people engaging with the church. And there's a need to turn this around. There's a need to show them the face of Jesus. There's a need for them to have a really personal relationship with him. So that many people come to know about Jesus, but they don't really develop a relationship with him personally. So a second reason for the new evangelization, and one of the things that Pope John Paul II was wanting to happen out of the new evangelization, was also a need for personal conversion in people's lives, a genuine change of heart. Not just coming to church on Sunday, but living my life however I feel like it. But we know from the Gospels that when people have that encounter with Jesus, it changes them on a deep level. And like I said in my own life, that was my own experience. When I knew that God loved me, when I knew the face of Jesus and encountered him personally, it made me want to change my life, to live for him alone. And that's a beautiful gift that we've got to offer people when we evangelize them. And so I think Pope John Paul II was thinking that people were missing out. They didn't know the person of Jesus, and they also didn't have their whole hearts given to him. And so one of the other reasons for the new evangelization is this need for conversion in every human heart. When someone has a conversion, it means that they want to really be a disciple of Jesus, that they want to have what he calls a complete and sincere adherence to Christ and his gospel through faith, accepting by a firm decision the saving sovereignty of Christ and becoming his disciple. That's what's on offer for all people when they become a disciple of Jesus. So thirdly, what Pope John Paul II wanted from this new evangelization was that it's not a new gospel. He didn't want to proclaim a new gospel or like a watered down version of the gospel, a watered down version of the cross that demands everything from you. That's not what the new evangelization is about at all, but rather going back to the core truths of our faith, to the Kerygma, to that central proclamation of the death and resurrection of Jesus, and to invite people into that real encounter with Jesus. So what does the new evangelization look like? The Pope John Paul II said that it had to be new in ardor, which is basically a way of saying kind of new in the fire of the Spirit. There needed to be a new fire in our hearts for evangelization, and a new fire in our hearts that people would know about the love of God. The new evangelization is also new because it's new in expression. So in this era, we're using different kinds of media, different ways of communicating the gospel. We might be using drama or art. We might be using language or music. We might be speaking in the language of the people. We might be using really contemporary ways of relating the gospel, and it's the same gospel message. We haven't taken anything out, but we're communicating in ways that really speak to the contemporary society. The new evangelization is also new in its methods and strategies. So you might have noticed over the last 30 years, there's lots of really creative ways that the gospel is now being proclaimed. We've seen new ecclesial movements come forward after the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s. There's different communities, there's evangelizing teams, there's schools of evangelizations. There's all different strategies and methods that we can use now to evangelize people and to share with them God's love. And that is a sign and a hope of the new evangelization. And finally, a feature of the new evangelization is that it's a lifelong process. We acknowledge that evangelization is not just a once-off event, but that to really evangelize someone means walking with them as a church through all different stages and loving them and discipling them through that whole process. That it's a lifelong process that we're all on together and that we need to love and support each other in that journey as much as we can. Okay, so I want to leave you with some encouragement from Pope Paul VI and also from Pope John Paul II as well. So these are some of the final kind of comments I want to say about the new evangelization. So Pope Paul VI, in his document Evangelii Nuntiandi in 1975, said that evangelizing is in fact the grace and vocation proper to the church. It's her deepest identity. She exists in order to evangelize. It's our call as Catholics to go and evangelize other people. Finally, Pope John Paul II said that the church's mission of evangelization can't be left to a group of specialists, but must involve the responsibility of all the members of the people of God. So I guess while you're watching this, it's up to you to think about, well, what role do I play in being a part of the new evangelization? What's my particular vocation? What's my particular calling to go out and to tell other people about the incredible and life-changing love of God?